Before the Union can freely move up and down the Mississippi, the Gibraltar of the West, Vicksburg, must be taken. The Union Army has moved across the river to the south, moved 60 miles overland to Jackson, and now has moved west via rail.
And after a series of unsuccessful assaults to break the Confederate line, it was decided that the best way to handle this army that's here is to go into siege and starve them out and wear them out, and invest the city with a larger and larger force, spreading the siege line north and south around the city, cutting off supplies in every facet. The Navy has control of the river, the Army has control of the land, and God has control of the time that the city will fall, I'd like to think.
We're here at Battery de Gallier, which is one of the principal siege lines outside the town of Vicksburg. And as you can see, there's artillery which for 47 days pounded the Confederate lines. Explain where in the siege does this particular piece of ground fit in?
We are amongst the batteries across this open space between the armies. The city proper is behind you and off your left shoulder, and that is the true objective, is to have the city under federal control, like the railroads, the river port as well, so that Mr. Lincoln will find that he has a river available to move good commerce down, up and down through the middle of the country. This is the anchor point. This is more or less the center point of the siege, from which then the army expands north and south and begins to curve around. And the principal result of that is it forces Pemberton to stretch his lines thinner and thinner to defend that new space, leaving the entire line weaker as it goes along. Throughout the course of these artillery barrages, sappers from mining towns in Pennsylvania that are with us and others are digging tunnels under the line. The Confederates can hear the digging in the ground, and they begin counter-digging to find these other mine shafts. As the siege gets near its end, we blow a hole in the line. And the assault was not coordinated to take advantage of that hole in the line, but I was resigning myself on July 1st that maybe for the next week we're going to have to dig in everywhere and blow out holes in their lines. And I was already designing plans based on these various sapper operations to blow it, because that seemed like the next successful evolution of entrenching and fortifying. It looks like tunneling is going to become a procedure that's involved. But by July 3rd, their garrison is starved out, the city is starved out, that Pemberton's officers come to him and they beg him, they say, if you love this army, you'll surrender it. And we've accomplished that goal in 47 days of just wearing them down to the point that they're starved out, but they're broken. And I think that is the principal result of this, is 32,000 men mostly will not fight again.
So it's hard to grasp until you're up here just how commanding these heights at Vicksburg are over this portion of the Mississippi. Explain to us why Vicksburg has to be taken. Why is this such a vital point? And how can guns up here prevent any movement along the Mississippi?
It's aptly described as the Gibraltar of the West because of that command of the location. Gibraltar itself commands the entrance to the Mediterranean. This literally commands the flow of the Mississippi. If we've, as we've done with capturing New Orleans and having control of the lower Mississippi, we can only get this far before the entire gauntlet of guns here will have command of the flow of anything from the south, let alone then the curve in the river. As soon as ships come into view on that curve, these guns can have the range on it to keep them from going any further. And that means there's no commerce coming. So it's the river equivalent of cutting track at that point, no matter what it is. And that the problem for military ships with guns is that the guns can't be elevated high enough to get the trajectory on the guns that are up here. So it's a high advantage, no pun intended.
And so there will be efforts by the Navy to assault Vicksburg.
Incredibly significant naval efforts. Yeah. Farragut brings deep water frigates up the river while the river is flowing deep enough to draft them. And he's fearful as he gets up here that the river flow is going to change, that the level will be too low, his vessels are trapped. And they move up around the curve at one point against the current. And they have to do these series of little jink turns to get around because of the sharpness of it and find the depth in the channel that's going to allow that. So the trap can be set very easily for these deep water ships to just be hammered by the artillery fire if they fail.
And even though the actual fire from the Navy doesn't play a significant advantage in taking Vicksburg, the Navy does still play a huge role in accomplishing that, yes?
And yes, they serve as a fire base, because what they can do then with mortar boats and the guns as elevated as they are, they're not going to concern themselves once we're laying siege. They're not going to concern themselves with the guns here, but they're going to harass the town.
And logistically, the Navy is absolutely
supreme.
key.
And it goes without saying for ammunition and supplies and evacuating wounded, but any foodstuffs that can possibly be brought. And during the siege, as Sherman has secured my right, it opens up the Yazoo Pass. And in the demonstrations of Sherman with the flotillas that Porter takes, the Yazoo River and its bayous up by Chickasaw Bluffs become another logistics point that funnel from that side, and we completely circumvent and bypass the threat here at that point.
So after a month of heavy fighting, 47 days of heavy fighting, the Confederates are absolutely worn down in Vicksburg, and Pemberton's officers tell him to save what's left of the army, and he agrees to an armistice. Take us through that meeting under that tree.
We meet person to person where he is expecting terms. Pemberton and I have been in the old army in Mexico, and he thought that because of that, like Buckner, they think because of that old connection, regardless of their denial of the Constitution, violation of their oath to support and defend it, that they're somehow going to be handled genteelly. And I tell him straight up that it's going to be an unconditional surrender. And he throws his sword, he claims that it's ungentlemanly, and he refuses to talk. I believe it's Colonel Bowers that steps forward and suggests that we create a commission of sorts to discuss things with his subordinates. John Bowen's one of them, who was my Missouri farming neighbor, is one of his generals. So Bowen and Bowers get together and they hammer out some sort of parole idea that the men can march out with their belongings, but they're stacking military equipment before it's considered a true surrender.
Now, belongings is an interesting term because the Confederates, and Pemberton in particular, ask for the permission to bring their property, and that means a little something else to rebel forces than it would to yourself.
By this point in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation becomes part of the war aimed to free slaves, and Lord knows for the last 6 months, every plantation about this area where we've encountered, they've been freed by virtue of our presence. So as I say, I have good staff who can keep me on an even keel, because I'm willing to accept that they can take their property, and to a northern ear, we don't regard human lives as property, yet I have to have that pointed out by staff that no, what they're trying to do is they consider the slaves and servants as property that they can take out with their inanimate belongings. So in the process of writing up the proper terms of the surrender, it's made clear that human lives will not be considered property, which infuriates them, but that's the deal.
So the terms are hammered out, the armies march past. Why are we at the courthouse here?
It's the signifying thing. This is the Warren County seat, where men of McPherson's Corps come in to secure the city, raise Old Glory above the courthouse, which clearly states we have control of the Mississippi River.
Sure, what would you say that's rather interesting about flags over that courthouse?
I believe it's 1957, after 1863, 57 on July 4th is the first time that Old Glory is again put over that courthouse on the nation's birthday.
So it's done in July of 63 and not again until
Correct.
1957.
They were so bitter about it at that time.
Surrender!